Okay, so let's begin. So we were in the middle of discussing, and I hope to conclude this part tonight, the status of a ksav. So again, just to get us back in context for a moment. So we were discussing the status of a contract in Jewish law. The standard contract is what we call a shtar, is either according to Rabbi Meir, a shtar be'edei chasima, which means you have a text, you have appended witnesses to the text, and then you hand over that document to the beneficiary, let's say, of the transaction, let's say a sale of a real piece of real estate, or kiddushin, the husband gives to the wife, or a gerushin, husband gives to the soon-to-be ex-wife. Either way, that's called a shtar be'edei chasima. Then there's something called a shtar be'edei mesira, that is a text in which there are no signators, but the document, the declaration, the description of the transaction is transmitted in the presence of two witnesses, and therefore it's considered to be a contract, that is validated by witnesses, even though the witnesses aren't in the text, but they are physically present when the object, changes hand. And then there's a third category. That's what we've been discussing last week, and we want to finish up with this week. And that's called ksav yado. Ksav yado is literally means, his own handwriting, meaning it's a document in which the declaration or the description of the transaction is written in the hand of the mischayev, of the person who is, assigning, rights to the other party. So in the case of, let's say the lokeach, right? The mocher is signing over a piece of real estate to the lokeach, to the purchaser. Or again, in the case of a get, the baal is handing over a bill of divorce to his wife. So he would write it out in his own hand, and then he would hand it, over. But it's not a shtar be'edei chasima, it's not a shtar be'edei mesira. So the question is, what is the legal status of a ksav yad? Does it achieve the same kind of stature as a shtar be'edei chasima or a shtar be'edei mesira, or does it fall short, or does it fall short? So there are two mishnayos, that's what we were investigating last week, that discuss this question. One is the Mishnah in Gittin, Pei Vav Amud Aleph, which we've seen quite a number of times. That's the Mishnah that says, Gimel Gittin Psulim, that there are three Gittin that midrabanan are probably, this is on, probably page, 4 or 5 on the Mar Makomos. Again, we appreciate the presence of the Mar Makomos, and it helps people follow, so we thank you for that. The Mishnah says on Pei Vav Amud Aleph, this is probably on page 4 or Pei Vav Amud Aleph, that the Gimel Gittin Psulin B'Mnisa Savlad Kosher. I'm just reviewing for a couple of minutes before we move on. The three Gittin that are rabbinically perceived to be inferior, and therefore we discourage their use. They're puzzle, they're disqualified midrabanan. But since minat Torah, they're effective. Imnises, if she gets married based on a divorce of one of these three types of bills of divorce, the marriage is terminated. She's an HSC. She's no longer an HSC. She's permitted to remarry. And if she has children, in the next phase of her life, those children will be ksherim. They won't be mamzerim, because even though we don't want her to use this divorce because it's an inferior quality divorce, b'diavad, after the fact, it is good enough. It's considered to be a get. So one of these three, we only really care about the first one right now. and that is Kosav Biksav Yado Ve'ein Alavedim. That's he wrote out in his own hand a description or declaration of his divorce action, and he handed it to his wife. But there are no Eidei Chasim, there are no signatories, so we prefer that there be Eidim. That's why it's possible. But Minat Torah, it's good enough. The question is what we've been dealing with. Minat Torah, it's good enough because it's a shtar. And if that's the case, would it work also for Kiddushin? Because Kiddushin, one of the three ways of getting married, Kesef, shtar, bia, one of the three ways is shtar. And actually the source of that, the Gemara says in Kiddushin and Daf Hey Amud Aleph, that the source of Kiddushei shtar is the Hekesh, the Yotzav Haisa, the comparison to Gerushin. So if Ksav Yad works in Gerushin, does that mean it works in Kiddushin or not? So if we think that Ksav Yad is a proper shtar, a proper contract, and it would work in other areas of halakha, then why wouldn't it work in Kiddushin? However, if we take the view that there's some unique allowance, when it comes to get, something very specific, then it's very possible that that doesn't apply to Kiddushin or Dinei Mamonos. So Rashi, this is what you were pointing out already. Rashi on Gittin, Pei Vav Amud Aleph, if you have it here in the Mar Makomos. Again, if we could go to the Mar Makomos just like about 3 pages or 4 pages down. I don't know if, do I have the ability to control them? No, right? Okay. Well, hopefully everybody has them in front of them. So if you look at Rashi, Rashi says, "Hi Tan Lav Krameir Svirale Amar Nechasima Karsi Dil Rabbi Meir Havlad Mamzer Ulaman de Mukilov Begamara Rabbi Meir Ikalamemer de Ksavyodo Kemea Edim Dami Velav Kirabi Eliezer Svirale Amar Edim Asira Karsi Da Polygrab Lazu Beseifa Alakivin de Ksavyodo Hu Bekasav Nasan Karina Bay Alfagav de Lake Edim Asira Kasher Midaraisa Miu Rabbanan Paslinu Dilma Asilach Shure Biksav Sofer. Hilkachlo Tinase Bimnises Avlad Kosher, Bedafka Ksav Yado, Ksav Sofer, Ve'insham Aid Avlad Mamzer. So that's a lot to take in. So Rashi basically has 3 different formulations to make it clear. Rashi says, Rashi's troubled. He says, if you hold like Rabbi Meir, who says that Eidei Chasima Karsi, then you need signatures in the get. So how could a Ksav Yad, how could an autograph, meaning only his own handwriting, how could that be enough? So Rashi gives at least 2, it's hard to know what the relationship is between them, but Rashi says 3 things. Thing number 1 is, you're right, this Mishnah is not according to Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir would think that a Ksav Yad is nothing, and that a Ksav Yad is, if you use a Ksav Yad and a child is born, and you remarried on the basis of a Ksav Yad, it would be, thank you very much. I think we're getting closer. If you could, just go back a little bit more, just a little bit more. Not forward, but backwards. A little more. Perfect. Yeah. So we have, I think we lost it. We just had it a sec. Yeah. Okay. Talmud Bavli Gittin Pei Vav Amud Aleph. If we could go continue a little bit. Just 1 second. Yeah, keep going. No. 1 second. Yeah, Rashi. Excellent. That's exactly it. So Rashi says, where it says Rashi Masachet Gittin Pei Vav Amud Aleph. So Rashi says, Hi Tana. The first one says, Hi Tana Lav Rabbi Meir Svirale. This doesn't work according to Rabbi Meir, because Rabbi Meir requires Eidei Chasima signatures. The Amar Eidei Chasima Karsi, the Rabbi Meir Havlad Mamzer. So that's very severe. According to Rabbi Meir, if you use a Ksav Yad, an autograph get, without any witnesses, and a child is born because of a marriage that took place relying on that Ksav Yad as a get, it wouldn't work, and the Vlad would be a Mamzer. But then Rashi says, well, Rabbi Meir, there is a view in the Gemara that says the Mishnah is according to Rabbi Meir. So that means Rabbi Meir has to have a compatibility with a Ksav Yad. How would that work? So here Rashi says two things. One is, Ika Meimar, Diksavyad Kimea Edim Dami. This is the second line in Rashi, that really a ksavyad is the equivalent to witnesses, because since he writes it in his own hand, it's as if he is admitting, and we have a rule that Hodah Spaldin is Kimea Edim Dami. Since Hodah Spaldin is Kimea Edim Dami, admitting something is the equivalent of having witnesses that prove it. So there's no bigger Hodah Spaldin than a written confession or a written declaration in my own hand, because if it's in my own hand, it's as if I'm, what do we need two witnesses to attest to the fact that I said it? You have the handwriting. My handwriting is saying it, right? So ksavyad is kamedim dami, and therefore, according to Rabbi Meir, you have more than what you need. If edei chasima work, then mea edim b'ksavyado work as well. So that's a second view of Rashi. According to that view, ksavyad should work not only in Gittin, it should work in any area of Jewish law. Because anytime edei chasima work, ksavyad should work, because ksavyad is kamei edim. So for example, we'll see in a moment, but in a loan situation, or more importantly, kiddushin, you're mekadesh b'shtar, according to this point in Rashi, that ksavyad is kamei edim dami, it should work. Right? However, if you continue on in Rashi, he says, V'lav Rabbi Elazar Svirale, the author of the Mishnah is not Rabbi Eliezer, the Amar Edim Mesira Karsi, because he holds you don't have to have the signatures inside the text, but you do need witnesses present when the text is transmitted. The Polig Rabbi Elazar B'Seifa, he's the author of the end of the Mishnah, not the beginning of the Mishnah. But then Rashi goes back to the issue of Ksavyad, and he says, El Kivin Ksavyadohu, the Kasav Nasan Karina Bey. This is very important. The Rashi says, actually, the reason Ksavyad works, he seems to be getting away from the idea of Ksavyad Kimei Eidim Dami, which is what he said before, which would make this just a regular shtar. What he says is it's a unique document that works in a get, even though it isn't a shtar. Why? Because the Torah in Parshas Kitetze uses the expression, the Kasav law, Sefer Krisus V'Nasam Biyada. So by saying the Kasav law, Sefer Krisus, it sounds actually like the emphasis in the Torah is on him, meaning the husband, actually writing the declaration. So that's a ksavyad. So what Rashi is trying to say is, if you need a shtar, then maybe Rabbi Meir, who needs Edei Chasima, would say that you don't have enough. But for a get, the Torah itself says v'kasav, law, right, v'nasan. So there's a ksiva, and there's a nasina, and therefore it works. But according to that logic, would it work in Dinei Mamanis? It might work, but it wouldn't work as a shtar. And would it work in Kiddushin? We'll get to that in a minute. So that's an interesting question, because the words v'kasav la sefer krisus v'nasam biyada do not appear in the parsha regarding Kiddushin. On the other hand, shtar Kiddushin is derived from a get. So if the source of shtar Kiddushin works with a ksavyad, shouldn't also the derivative of it work with a ksavyad? So actually, that is a major argument among the Rishonim we're going to turn to right away. So if you look at the next Maramakom, it says Talmud Bavli Masechet Yevamos Daf Lamed Amud Beis. Excellent, perfect. So there's a certain Gemara there. The Gemara is comparing Kiddushin and Gerushin. The Gemara says Kulan Shahaya Bahen Kiddushin O Gerushin B'Safek Hare'elu Atzaros Choltos Lo Misyavmos Ketzad Safek Kiddushin Zarek Lo Kiddushin Safek Karav Lo Safek Karav Lo Zeu Safek Kiddushin Safek Gerushin. What's an example of a case where you are involved in what seems to be an act of Gerushin, but where there's some question whether you did it appropriately? What's the example? Kasav Biksav Yado Ve'ein Alavedim, or Kasav Alavedim Ve'ein Bozman, or Yesh Mozman Ve'ein Bo Eled Echad. Zeu Safek Gerushin. So when the Gemara wants to provide an example of something that is not an universally acclaimed or uniformly agreed upon Gerushin, sorry, it brings the three examples of the Mishnah on Pevav Amud Aleph, right, which we just read. So this Gemara in Yevamos is telling you that the Pevav Amud Aleph cases remain problematic. Okay. However, let's continue. Rashi on the spot will explain what is Kasa B'Ksav Yado. Interesting. So he says, the Kaimalon, Hotzi Olav Ksav Yado Shu Chayv Lo Govin Menachasam B'nei Chorin, Alma Ksav Yado below Edin, right? Milsehi. Interesting. So this is the Mishnah in Masachet Bava Basra that we read last week. And which appears, let's just turn to it for one more minute, just to remind everybody. This is, I'm going to jump around just a little bit. It's like a full page ahead, and then we'll come back to the rest. If we could go up one page, keep going. Thank you. More, a little more, a little more. We're going to go back to it in a few minutes, but just go a little bit more. No, I think we went too far. Much too far. 1 second. Yeah, a little bit before. Keep going before. Yeah. A little more before. Stop. Okay, perfect. Yeah. So the Mishnah in the Mishnah in Kuf Ayin Hey Amud Beis and Bava Basra, perfect. It says Hotzi Olav Ksav Yoda Shu Chayv Lo Govim Menachasam B'nei Chorin. So this example of an autograph, we'll call it, or something in his own writing without witnesses, we have two Mishnayos, as I mentioned. It works in a get min Torah. What about in Jewish civil law? Let's say in a loan. So as I mentioned last week, there are two characteristics. There are two types of loans. There's a milva al peh and a milva bishtar. There's a loan where there's no contract. There might be witnesses, but there's no contract. When that happens, that's one scenario. The other scenario is a milva, a loan in which there is a contract. The benefit of having a contract is dual. Number one, you can collect from the liened property, not just from the liquid assets of the debtor. The creditor can collect the debtor's liened properties. What does that mean? It means that, again, Ruvain borrowed $100 from Shimon. Okay? So Ruvain owes Shimon $100. At the time, Reuven had some real estate. And he had other property and other assets. Subsequently, Reuven sold his real estate, and it was purchased by Levi. Levi is now the new owner of Reuven's real estate. But when it comes time for Reuven to repay Shimon, his creditor, for some reason he's already, he did some bad business deals. He has no other liquid assets. So if you can be govim menachasam mishubadim, that means that you can collect. It means that Shimon can grab the property, the real estate that used to belong to him, that now belongs to Levi. That's called, mortgaged or liened property. So if you have a milva bishtar, not just a milva al peh, the advantage is you can collect from menachasam mishubadim. That's one advantage. The second advantage is that what we call shtar chabyari my boy. This is what we talked about last week. I'm just reviewing for a minute. Shtar chabyari my boy means that if, same scenario, let's say Ruvain borrowed money from Shimon. Ruvain owes money to Shimon. And then Shimon, after a month, let's say the debt is up in a month. So in a month and a day, Shimon comes to Ruvain and he says, I would like my money back. Thank you very much. It's time to pay me back. And Ruvain says, I paid you back yesterday. After the 30 days, I already paid you back. So that is called Kofar Bakol. He denies everything, as opposed to Moda B'Miktsas, where he admits that he owes him, but not the full amount, but a part amount. Let's say I say, you owe me $100, and you answer me, and you say, I don't owe you 100, but I do owe you 50. So let's say it's a situation where you deny the whole thing. I say you owe me $100, and you say I don't owe you a penny. So if it's a milva al peh, if there's no contract, then we believe the debtor when he says he repaid the loan. But if there is a contract, so as long as that contract is in the hands of the creditor, in this case, Shimon is holding on to the contract, then Reuven is not believed to say that he repaid the loan.
So whoever holds the contract controls the decision. We go with whoever has the contract.
Has an advantage because it's perceived as a kind of smoking, gun. Meaning the argument is, if you really paid me back, wouldn't you have been insistent on either getting a receipt, this is what we discussed last week, or tearing up the smoking gun evidence against you? So when a typical milva al pan, a typical milva b'shtar, there are two differences between them. One is, can you collect from liened property or only from liquid assets? That's distinction number one. Distinction number two is, are you believed, is the debtor believed when he says he repaid? Will we believe him as kofar hakol, or will we say what's called shtar chabyadi my boy? So what's fascinating is if you look at the Mishnah in Bava Basra, the Mishnah talks about ksav yado. This is the second Mishnah in Shas to speak about ksav yado. We know it works min Torah for a get, although we're not happy about it. But what about in dini mamanis? What about in civil law? So the Mishnah says, Hotzi olav ksav yado shu chayiv lo govim menechasim b'nei choreh, which basically means when it comes to collecting liened property, it doesn't work. Meaning when it comes to liened property, it's as if there is no shtar. But the Mishnah didn't discuss the second scenario, which is, but what about if the lovet, if the debtor claims that he already repaid the loan, but the malveh, right, the creditor, is holding on not to a shtar but to a ksav yad? Will we say the equivalent of shtar cha b'yadi? We will say ksav yadcha b'yadi, my boy. Will we say that or not? So here we have a massive argument among the Rishonim. We read this last time, so I'm just giving you the quick recap so we can move forward and talk about Kiddushin in just a minute. So we have a major argument. The Rashbam and the Balamor, and then the Rashbam and Bava Basra and Daf Mem Amud Aleph, and Tosas in Ksuvos and Daf Chaf Aleph Amud Aleph, and the Tosas reading Ksuvos, Chaf Aleph Amud Aleph. A whole group of, mostly Chachmei Tzorfat, Chachmei Ashkenaz, a little bit of Chachmei Provence, all of them say, even though there's no Gviyah Menachasa Mishubadim, even though you can't collect from lien property if all you have is an autograph, and you don't have a real signed contract with witnesses, but you do get the second benefit, and that is that you would say, Ksav Yadcha Biyadi, my boy. Why is it that I'm holding on to your handwritten declaration, right, that you owe me money? Why didn't you insist on, neutralizing that if you really paid? And therefore, it's considered a smoking gun or equivalent. And if it's considered the equivalent of a smoking gun, then we are not going to believe the claim of a payment on the basis of kofar hakol, of completely denying it. So basically, if we were to ask the question, is a ksav yad treated in Jewish civil law like a contract or like an oral agreement? The answer would be, according to Rashi and according to Rashbam and according to Tosas and according to Balamor and according to Tosas Rid, the answer would be it's a mixed verdict. When it comes to collecting from lien property, we treat it like an oral agreement, not like a written agreement, not like a contract. However, when it comes to the principle of shtar chabiyadi my boy, there we treat it as if it is a contract. It's interesting, the Bala Ma'or tries to bring a proof for his view. There are two types of proofs that the Rishonim bring for this position, that if the malveh, if the creditor is holding on to a ksav yad, that we don't believe the loveh, the debtor, when he says he repaid it. There are, two types of proofs that are brought for this. One is the logical proof, and that is if the whole reason why typically we believe the person who's holding the shtar, a contract, is because it's considered like a smoking gun, and it's just very damaging to the credibility of the other party to think that he would have paid and not gotten either a receipt or had the evidence against him, ripped up. Well, that what's the difference between a ksav yad and a shtar? Basically, it's the same problem. In both cases, we're leaving outstanding evidence. If I claim that I paid, why would I have left outstanding, incriminating evidence in the hands of the other party? So that's the logical point that Bala Ma'or and Tosfos and Rashbam all make. But they have also an interesting textual proof. They say, listen, the Mishnah already addresses the status of ksav yad. And the Mishnah says when it comes to liened property, right, goveh min achasim b'nei chorin, only we treat it like a milva al peh. We treat it like it's not a contract. So why didn't the Mishnah mention both? Why didn't it also say, meaning if the other view was correct, and by the other view is the view of the Rif, the view of the Rambam, the view of the Ramban, they all say that a ksav yad, is a milva al peh. It has the equivalent status of an oral loan, not a contract. And therefore, not only is there no gviyim and achasim mishabadim, there is no shtar chabiyari my boy equivalent either. We don't treat it like a smoking gun. So the question is, why not? But the other question is, if that's true, how come the Mishnah was very explicit when it said that there's no gviyim and achasim mishabadim? Why didn't it mention the other factor? Balamor says it must be that the Mishnah is saying a ksav yad is like a contract, except that there's no gviyim and achasim mishabadim. Because it spells out the difference, and implicitly it's telling us that when it comes to the question of smoking gun or incriminating outstanding evidence, that in that respect it is like a shtar. A ksav yad is like a shtar. However, the Ramban,
and that's the opinion of Rashi when he says milsahi.
I'm sorry?
Is this the opinion of Rashi where he concluded milsahi?
Yes. Yes. When they say that it's milsahi, that means like it's like a shtar.
Yeah.
There's no gviyam. Excellent, very good. That's exactly what I mean. There's no nechasim mishubadim. Yeah, maybe that's because there's no kol. When it comes to gviyam and nechasim mishubadim, some of the Rishonim explained it's a practical question. It's a buyer beware. Think of it this way: the purchaser of the property. What happens in a lien situation or a mortgage situation? Right, there's a transaction between two parties, right? Ruvain and Shimon. Ruvain lends money to Shimon. Shimon owes money to Ruvain, correct?
Yeah.
Is it fair that Shimon sold his real estate separate from this, transaction? And 3 weeks later, Shimon, either because he got a good deal or maybe he's, hit on hard times, so he sold the real estate to Levi. To Levi, a third-party purchaser, bought a property from Shimon. Now, Ruvain, who lent money to Shimon, it comes to collect, and there are no liquid assets. Nebuch, Shimon is having a tough time. So Shimon has nothing to pay him with. Liquid assets in the halacha is called bnei chorin. As you see, govim and mechasim bnei chorin. Chorin means free, meaning liquid, available assets. Assets that are not encumbered would be the right legal term. Unencumbered assets, liquid assets. Now, so what happens? Reuven comes to Shimon. Shimon has nothing to pay him. But in a case where there's a real shtar, be'edei chasima. So Reuven says, fine, did you have any real estate property at the time of the transaction 30 days ago that you subsequently, sold off? And the answer is yes. He sold a piece of property to Levi. So Reuven says, okay, I'm going to grab that. I'm going to seize that property, right, for the repayment of my debt. Now, poor Levi, right? Levi is the purchaser. Levi now says, well, I bought this property in good faith from Shimon, right? How does Reuven have the right to usurp my acquisition? I don't know Reuven. What's the answer? The answer is that he has the responsibility to know when he buys a piece of property from Shimon, Levi, what do you do these? Like you do a title search or something, right? Or the person's credit history. But more than that, so that part of that is called a kol. One of the reasons that the Gemara gives in Kiddushin, Daf Yud Gimel, and the end of Bav Basra, and a few other places, why is it that a milva al peh, you're not gova b'nechasim mishubadim, and a milva b'shtar, you are gova b'nechasim mishubadim? That's the halacha. I mean, there are different views in the Gemara. There's something called shibuda d'oraisa, which means that even in a milva al peh, you could be gova from liened property. But we paskin that this is a difference between a contract and a verbal transaction or loan. So why? What's the difference? So that's what the Gemara says in Kiddushin and Bava Basra. The difference is there a call. If you borrow money and there's a contract, so it's traceable and it makes an impression. People know about it. And therefore there's a buyer beware aspect to the acquisition of property by Levi. When Levi buys property from Shimon, it's not excusable for him to say, I didn't know that there was a lien on this property. Because since the initial transaction was done with a contract, right? It was filed somewhere. There are witnesses who, are in the contract itself. Therefore, it generates, publicity. That's what call is. And since it's a public or publicized sale or transaction, so there's a kind of buyer beware associated with it. If he did his due diligence, or if he was just clued into the reputation or the status of this transaction, if there's a call and therefore buyer beware, he'll lose the property.
Antithetical. That sounds antithetical, because when Levi bought the property, there was no lien on the property because
there was.
But there was no action in which Reuven
there was a lien. The lien on the property. There has already to the lien on the property begins as soon as the initial transaction. Let's say, in other words, the loan transaction took place. Otherwise, it wouldn't work. You're totally right, but that's not what we're talking about. Let's say where are we now? Let's say on February 1st, right? Shimon borrowed money from Reuven on February 1st, and the borrowing took place with a contract. So on February 1st, the real estate that is still liquid assets of Shimon is already leaned potentially to a repayment of that debt, meaning if Shimon is subsequently going to sell off that piece of real estate, right, there's a prior mortgage on that property that belongs to Reuven. And therefore, when Reuven, on day number 31, let's say the loan was day number 1, let's say the real estate property was sold on day 20, and let's say the collection date is day 31. So on day 31 or day 32, when Reuven comes to collect the property, he says, listen, I have a lien on this property since day 1. It was sold, on day 20. So he has prior rights to the property, like any mortgage. That's in any, like in American law too. That's a lien. That's a lien or a mortgage. A lien or a mortgage means that there's a right of collection, a first right of collection for, the person who, for whom a lien was established on the property. But
Rabbi,
is that if it was a milva al peh, if there was no official contract with witnesses, so then it's not public enough, and then there's no buyer beware, and then there's not enough publicity, and that wouldn't be fair to the purchaser. So that's why there's the lien requires that there be a public, oriented transaction, which means a milva bishtar. Now, the question is, what's a ksav yad? A ksav yad doesn't have witnesses, so it doesn't have kol in that sense, but there is a document. That's the point. So what the Mishnah is saying is that there's no gviyah minachasa mishubadim, but it doesn't tell us what about the smoking gun idea. So the Balamor said, listen, if it only tells us one of the two consequences don't apply, then the assumption is that the other one does apply. However, the Ramban retorts to this. Ramban says, no, the Mishnah gives us one fact because one fact is responsible for the other fact. The Ramban says, the reason that, that there's a smoking gun isn't just because there's outstanding evidence, of the initial debt. Maybe that alone wouldn't be considered a smoking gun. It's a smoking gun because that outstanding evidence is the publicity that allows for collecting a lien. But if there's no lien, then the smoking gun doesn't matter. So the Ramban says the Mishnah only says one thing because it only needs to say one thing. The reason that there's no problem of ksav yadcha biyadi, my boy, is a consequence of the fact that there's no geviyah menachasa mishubadim. Everybody with me so far?
yes, but Rabbi, I have a question.
Yeah, sure.
In those days, they didn't have such a thing as a recording of a lien or records kept. There's no way.
Well, I mean, they had records kept. They had, again, you have a contract, and either the contract is deposited with the courts, or the contract, is in my home and I can bring it to the courts. But the point is that a contract was made and other people were involved in the transaction. Maybe there wasn't, a requirement to file it in the county, which is a great idea, in the county clerk's office or something like that. I think in some places they did file things in the Bezdin. For example, the Bezdin is used sometimes to authenticate, we'll get back to these in the next few weeks, to authenticate signatures of witnesses. The courts keeps records too.
But normally you have
What if Levi, when he bought the property from Shimon, included in the shtar that he has to swear that there was no lien on the property that his buying or any other transaction occurred, and that he has sole entitlement to the property? Would it?
Well, if Levi, you're saying, what if Levi, when he purchased the property from Shimon, made a condition that he's only buying it if there's no lien? So
Correct.
That's a great point. That's a great point. It wouldn't have any effect on Reuven's prior right to collect the property, because Shimon, if Shimon lies to Levi, right, that shouldn't adversely affect the rights of Reuven, which came first. However, it would have impact on the liability of Shimon to Levi. meaning there are going to be two Dine Torah, two separate adjudications here. Meaning,
But Shimon is still going to have a liability to Levi because the property got taken back.
well, that's the question. That's a separate topic. The question of achrayus to sofer. So in a situation where there's a buyer beware call, where it's publicized, and Levi, when he bought the property from Shimon, knew of the possibility that he could lose it because it's a mortgaged and lien property, there may or may not be recourse, for him to go back to Shimon, depending on how he set up his purchase. That's number one. But remember, there's an important fact that you're forgetting, which isn't the fatal necessarily, but it's important, and that is the only reason Reuven came after Levi's property is because Shimon didn't have any liquid assets left. So it's not going to help Levi so much, even if Shimon is liable, because Shimon is lacking liquid assets. He couldn't pay back Reuven. That was the whole problem. He's living, hand, to mouth. He couldn't pay back Reuven. What makes you think he's going to be able to pay back Levi, right? So there are two questions. Number one, is Levi's purchase protected separately, with Shimon? But either way, it doesn't affect Reuven. It's Reuven will tell you, that's not my problem. That's between you and Shimon. But because it is between him and Shimon, then the fact that Shimon was impoverished and didn't have liquid assets to pay back. Remember, Reuven cannot grab, right, the mortgaged real estate, right, that's now in Levi's hands, unless he first tries to get liquid, unencumbered assets from Shimon. So the case is a case where, at least when he was looking to be repaid, Shimon, was in a financial state where he couldn't pay him back. That's why when Levi, even if Levi comes after Shimon and says, listen, it's fine that he took my property, but you should indemnify me for that. But with what? He just didn't have any liquid assets to take care of Reuven, unless all of a sudden he became successful. After Reuven collected the property, all of a sudden Shimon came into his own fortune, or, he had a restoration of good, fortune, and now he has liquid assets. Then there would be a separate question, depending on how the sale between Levi and Shimon was structured. There would now be a discussion about Levi receiving satisfaction for his loss from Shimon, yes or no. But as long as Shimon doesn't have liquid assets, it's all very abstract because there's nothing to pay from, right? So you can see the halacha has very clear-minded. This is a massive topic. These are topics that range across, all of Jewish civil law, especially Masechet Bava Basra, but also a little bit in Bava Kama, and some in Bava Metzia, and some in Masechet Ksuvos, a little bit in Yevamos. This whole question of liened property and the different levels of security. These are very, very extensive halachic topics. The halacha always had a very sophisticated, view, about the responsibilities of, repaying, and has very complex instruments, quasi, ownership or the ability. There's something called a mashkon, right, which is like, a pawn or a security. There are different types of mashkon. There are different types of nechasim mishubarim, of liens and mortgages, frankly. There's something called an apoteki mefurash, a regular shibud, the shibud of what's called milva bishtar, the shibud of milva al peh. It's a very complex area of the halakha. I'm trying to simplify it, to make it clear, because we're just zeroing in on the status of something that's in between an oral loan and a written loan. What?
The reason we're discussing this, that it seems
Yeah.
disturbing and unjust that Levi should should suffer any loss because of what occurred between Shimon and Reuven.
No, but
Levi,
that's not unjust. That's in any culture, including American law, there's something called a mortgage and a lien. And there's a buyer beware. Why is it unjust?
but Levi entered.
If you
into
take a
an
loan,
agreement
if you
without
engage,
knowledge of what transpired between Shimon and Reuven.
say that again.
Levi entered into a business agreement without knowledge of what had
No, but he has
between Shimon
the.
and Reuven.
No, that's not true, because that's what a call is. The call is what the call means, that there is sufficient publicity in what took place between Reuven and Shimon that Levi is under the category of buyer beware. If that's a difference between a milva bishtar and a milva al peh, that's exactly the difference. A milva al peh, there's no reason, there's not enough publicity for Levi to either have the ability to find out or to check into the relationship or the status of the property that he's going to purchase in terms of it being vulnerable as a lien, as a mortgage, etc. But in a milva bishtar, that's the whole point. There is a call. It's something that takes place that other parties know about, and therefore there's either a record or there is sufficient publicity, that people know about it. And therefore, no one's tricking anybody. It's a buyer beware situation. Levi has the ability to know about it. If he's a responsible purchaser, he is obligated to know about it. And therefore, he's vulnerable. This is what a mortgage or a lien is in any financial instrument. It means that you have somebody else has the first right of this property, and therefore, if it's subsequently sold,
right, it's real. That's how the
what a
real
mortgage
world
is.
works.
What is a
real world
mortgage?
works.
Right. If that's what a mortgage is, right?
Correct.
So that again, the fairness issue that you're bringing up is a very appropriate question, but the solution to it is kol. It's buyer beware. It's the publicity and the objectivity when there's a contract, that makes available this information to the public.
Yeah, and everyone should do due diligence before they buy something.
That's
right?
what due diligence is.
Right,
People who
right.
don't do due diligence cannot, claim.
You cannot blame anyone but themselves.
Okay. Anyways, so but the upshot of all, sorry, it's taking a little longer than we thought, but the upshot of all this is that a ksav yad, an autograph, meaning something that was not witnessed by, two objective third-party, witnesses, but it's simply it's exactly situated in between, the two extremes. A milva al peh, right, a loan without a contract, even if there are witnesses, but there's nothing in writing, is basically a private affair. There's no call. And there's no call, there's no shibudim, because exactly of what you brought up, because it's unfair. It's unfair to Levi, who betmimus libo, he wasn't obligated to do due diligence if there was no publicity, and there were no other parties involved. This was like, just a private arrangement between these two parties. And therefore, there's no gviyim and nechasim mishubadim. There's also no shtar, so there's no shtar chabyali my boy. Milva bishtar generates publicity, and the shtar itself has legal standing, so it's a scorching, damaging, piece of evidence to leave, unneutralized if you really repaid the loan. So there's geviyim and chasim mishubadim, and there's also shtar chabyali my boy. But a ksav yad, on the one hand, is a written document, right? But it's a written document, which doesn't include other parties to the transaction. So it's more than an oral agreement, even in the presence of witnesses, because it's something in writing. There's a text, actually, there's a document, but it's much less than either Eidei Chasima or Eidei Mesira. The Gemara in Bava Basra, Kufayin Vav Mid Aleph, which we have here on the page, which we read last week, so I'm not going to read it again, but the Gemara discusses what happens if you authenticate the Ksav Yad. You go to court and you establish beyond a shadow of a doubt that it's the handwriting of it's the handwriting of Shimon. So that's been, there's no question that this is a forgery. So the Gemara wants to know, does that help with Nechasim Mishubadim? The Gemara says, no, it's still inadequate. So the Gemara says, what about Shtar Be'edei Mesira? So Shtar Be'edei Mesira is also in between, right? The most public, knowledge and the greatest call comes from a Shtar Be'edei Chasima. You have a contract. The contract has the witnesses inside. It's a good raya. Everybody is aware of it. It makes a buzz. It leaves an impression. It's not something which is done quietly or privately. Right? The other extreme is Milva al Peh. In between those are two other cases. Milva with a shtar, not Be'edei Chasima, but Be'edei Mesira, meaning there are witnesses who are there when the document is handed over, but they're not inside the document. That's less publicity than Eidei Chasima, but more publicity than a Ksav Yad. And the other one is Ksav Yad. So the Gemara is, it was basically asking, why is Eidei Mesira, Shtar Be'edei Mesira, better than a Ksav Yad? And that's the last, if you just look at the last line of the Gemara, I'm not going to go through the whole thing because we discussed the last one. Shiny Hassam de Mishas Ksiva, who Deshibed Nafshe. Because the shibud, right, the lien, is something that was anticipated because we knew that when this contract is given, it's going to be given in public in front of two objective witnesses. Even though they're not written in the document now, that's good enough. Anyways, the end result, I'm glad that, this is stimulating discussion because it's a very interesting topic. And, it's something that should stimulate discussion. But what emerges from this is that when it comes to a get, it's unequivocal that Min Torah, a Ksav Yad, is a proper get. But we're not sure whether it's correct to say that it's a proper get because it's a contract, a shtar, or it's a proper get because even though it's not a contract, the Torah uses the expression of, v'kasav v'nasan. So even though it isn't a contract formally, it is a ksiva, it is something written, and it's something that was transmitted. So then if we look, partially what the what the Rashi was saying in Yevamos was, look at the Mishnah in Bava Basra. Meaning, what's the status of Ksav Yad in civil law? Forget about divorce law for the moment. The answer is depends on your point of view. It's complicated. Meaning, on the one hand, there's no Gviyam and Nechasim Mishubadim. You don't have the ability to collect lien property from a Ksav Yad. On the other hand, there's a massive debate whether we treat the outstanding, evidence of a Ksav Yad like a smoking gun or not. So in the end of the day, is it a contract or it's not a contract? So Rashi was saying, it's a contract. You just can't be gova minchasim mishubadim because there's no call. It's not public. But the Rambam and the Rif don't believe that. Let's go to the Rambam just for a minute. If we could move, let's see, 1 second. Yeah, if you could move forward a little bit. Yeah, perfect, exactly. Do one more little piece. Oh, perfect. Okay. So the 1 second. Perfect. Okay, exactly that. So halacha gimel. It's this parak yud aleph hilchos malva v'lova halacha gimel. Rambam says hotzi olav ksav yado shehu chayiv lo. A person produces an autograph, I'll call it, meaning his own handwriting, no witnesses, that establish that he owes money. Shimon, Ruvain has a document that says that Shimon writes that he owes Ruvain money. The Ein Shamedim, there are no witnesses. Afal Pisha Huksak Sav Yado Bebezin, this is based on the Gemara. Even if you've authenticated the signature and established that the handwriting really belongs to Shimon, so it's not a forgery, Bebezdin, and you did this, remember somebody said before, that they didn't file thing. No, you went to Bezdin, you went to the courts. You authenticated the signatures in the courts. So listen to the language of the Rambam. This doesn't say this language in the Mishnah. This is coming from the Rif, but expanded on by the Rambam. Harei zeh kemilva al peh lechol davar. Rambam chooses his words very carefully.
But Rabbi, I don't understand.
What's this? One more second. Harei zeh kemilva al peh lechol davar. It's like an oral, right, loan. But there's a ksav yad. And what are the two consequences? Just give me one more second. Bimton shepirao, if he claimed that it was repaid, nishba hesas v'niftar. We don't believe him. It's not treated as a contract at all. The ein agova b'ksav zeh lo min hayorshav v'lo min halakuchos, and there's no nechasim mishubadim either. So the Rif and especially the Rambam are basically saying in Jewish civil law, a ksav yad works for something, but mostly legally, doesn't have the status of a contract. And Rashi was saying it does have the status of a contract, it just doesn't have a kol, so there's no gviyah menachasim mishubadim. So we are left with some confusion in the Mishnah and Gittin about the status of ksav yad again, and we are left with some confusion even in civil law where this is debate. Chazan had a question.
I'm looking at, thank you. I'm looking at this halacha gimel very carefully at the wording.
Okay.
What the Rambam says, "Hotzi alav ksav yodo shehu chayav lo."
Yeah.
Who is that? It's not clear to my mind. Who is it? Hotzi alav ksav yodo. Is it the love or the malve?
Malve.
It's a malve. That's all. But
yeah. The malve produces. Remember, the love wrote out in his own handwriting an IOU. He gave it, if he keeps it, it doesn't do anything. He hands it to the malva so that the malva will have evidence so that he can collect. So now the malva is holding on to the ksav. The ksav yado is the ksav of the love, but it's in the hands of the malva. That's what an IOU is. If you want to borrow money from me with an IOU, you have to write me in your handwriting an IOU. You have to hand it to me so that I can use it to collect the money. So hotzi olav ksav yado means the malva produces the ksav yado of the lova. We've been talking about Reuven and Shimon. It would be Reuven, right, pulls out the ksav yad, right, of Shimon, shehu chayav lo. You're right. It's a little, if you didn't know who's who. Shehu chayav lo. That Shimon, meaning the lova, chayav lo to Reuven, the creditor. The ein sham edim. There are no witnesses on this document, only an autograph, only an IOU in his handwriting. Even though it's the signature of Shimon, the lova, has been authenticated in Bezdin, so he can't claim it's a forgery. Nonetheless, even though it is a physical document, hareza kemilva al peh lechol davar. Those words, the word hareza milva al peh already appears in the Rif, not in the Gemara. Lechol davar is the Rambam's edition. So the Rambam's taking a conceptual stand. He's saying, don't think this is a form of a star. It's not. It's just a fancy milva al peh. V'im talin shapara, and therefore if lova, Shimon, claims I paid you yesterday, and that then nishba hesas v'niftar. Since it's a milva al peh, even though there is a physical document, but the physical document doesn't attain the legal status of a contract. Therefore, there's no shtar chabiyadi my boy. And point number 2, he cannot seize property on the basis of a lien, not from the a subsequent purchaser who we were talking about before, Levi, and or let's say Shimon dies and he has heirs. That also requires kviyah minachasa mishubadim.
Sure.
Can't do that in the case of ksav yad. So the Rambam's view is that this isn't a shtar, it's a milva alpeh. Now, what is the Rambam's now? Let's talk about kiddushin. Okay, is there any other questions before that? Before we get to it? Oh, we're good.
All clear.
Good, excellent. So now, if it's clear, but what's clear is that it's not clear.
Sure.
Meaning that a ksav yad,
Sure.
is something in between, a contract and an oral agreement. And there's a debate whether it's closer to a contract or it really is a contract with some minor adjustments, or it's more like a oral agreement, with a piece of paper or something in between. So now the question is, what about kiddushin? So let's first look, we have the Rambam already open. So let's look at the Rambam first. And we have to end in a couple of minutes, so let's try to get it in. So what is the Rambam's view? In Hilchos Gerushin, the Rambam, you have it open in front of you, Perek Aleph, the Rambam, one second. The Rambam says in Halacha Yud Gimel that, let me just make sure I have it in mind. You have to hand over a get in the presence of Edim. Harehu Omer al Pishnaim Edim o Shlosha Edim Yakum Davar. The EF Shar Shatia Zu Ayom Erba Vabala B'Misas Bezdin L'Machar Tia Lo Muteris below Edim. The Rambam says you have to transmit a get in the presence of 2 witnesses, Eidei Kiyum, because it's impossible that we would simply rely on the words of the protagonists when the consequences or the stakes are so high, right? Right now, she's an Eishasish, she's prohibited to the world. And we want through this get to accomplish her, freedom. L'machar tia muteris below Edim. Below Edim, we can't do that, and therefore we require Edim. And therefore, if you hand over a document without any witnesses, there's no get. Bamedvar Maburim, says the Rambam, get ksav yad hasofer. That's if the text was written by a third party, by a sofer.
Mm-hmm.
Aval, now we're getting to our topic. Avalim kosav habal haget biksav yado. But if the husband himself wrote, it's an autograph, he wrote in his own writing, or v'chasam alaved echad v'nosnula hareza get puzzle. It's a get puzzle because it's gimel gittin psulim. We are not happy with the standards being used in this get, but it's only puzzle, it's not batel. Meaning, kasav alav biksav yado, whether there is or isn't an eid echad, min Torah will be a proper get. Correct? That's Rambam and Halacha Yudalid.
He says it's get pasul.
Pasul means midrabanan. Remember, the Mishnah says, Shlosha Gittin Psulim, V'havlad, Ein Havlad Mamzer. The Rambam says very clearly in Hilchos Gerushin that whenever he uses the word batel or eino get, that means minatorah. And whenever he uses the phrase pasul, that only means midrabanan.
The
So here
Rabban.
Rambam is saying that it's pasul midrabanan, exactly like the Mishnah, that min Torah, it's okay. Now look at halacha tazayin. Chasmu bo shnayim, this we've discussed already. Let's say instead of there being two witnesses present at the handing over of the shtar or the get, there's ede chasima, but there are no ede mesira. Oshenibso ede mesira psulim, areza kasher, ho ve'edim shabo ksherim hare get yotzim mitachas yada, v'yesh shahorim minagonim shu pasel, which again only means midrabanan. What comes out of the Rambam? That min Torah you could have a get be'ede chasima, right? Even without ede mesira, even though he was not happy about it, but there would be kasher. Or if you only had a ksav yad, that would be kasher too, even though min Torah, but it would be pasul b'drabanan, correct? What about kiddushin?
Mm-hmm.
So now look in Hilchos Ishus, look in the halacha before that. Perek Gimel halacha Gimel. Here the Rambam says, everybody have that? Perek Gimel halacha Gimel of Hilchos Ishus. If you go further in the screen, if we could move forward a little bit, we have the Hilchos Gerushin, Perek Aleph halacha Yud Gimel. We have halacha Yud Dalid. We have halacha Tazayin. That's good. Keep going. Keep going. Keep going. Oh, wait a minute. Does it keep going? Let's see. No. My mistake. Yeah, no. Yeah. Perek Gimel halacha Gimel of Ishus. You have it right there. Perfect. Okay. The Rambam says in Perek Gimel, Hilchos Ishus halacha Gimel, v'im kidesh b'shtar, if the kiddushin was with a shtar, a contract, kosev ala niyar, or ala cheres, he can write it on paper. It doesn't have to be parchment, or even on cheres, on earthenware, o al he'oleh, or on a leaf, for example. Now, kol davar sheyir, so anything that he wants, and he writes hareat mekudeshesli, o hareat meuresesli, v'chol kiyosa b'dvar meili. He writes the text, the language of kiddushin, the no snala b'fnei edim, and he has to give it to her in the presence of witnesses. What's so interesting about this? What the Rambam says or what the Rambam doesn't say? What the Rambam omits. When it comes to a get, what did the Rambam say? You could either, there are three options, basically. The preferred option is that there be a get be'edei mesira. That there be a physical edei kiyum when you hand over the get. But as a backup, which is also kosher, if you had edei chasima without edei mesira at all, that would also work. And it might be pasul midrabanan, but it's kosher min Torah, even just to have a ksav yad.
Mm-hmm.
However, when it comes to shtar kiddushin, instead of giving you three options, a preferred, a backup, and a pasul midrabanan, but still good midoraisa, the Rambam provides only one option. What's that option? That the Edom be present at the time of the Mesira. Moreover, the example that the Rambam uses is one where he says you can write on a niyar, you can write even on a cheres. In Hilchos Gerushin,
I have a problem with the ale, but okay, let's not.
Allah is like a leaf of a plant or something.
Yeah, but it doesn't last really.
Okay.
If it dries up, okay, but
Okay.
Right. It doesn't have to last. As long as it lasts, as long as it exists when it exists, that's fine. But the point is this: in why are the three options in get and only one option in shtar, a kiddushin? Moreover, as I say, The Rambam in Hilchos Gerushin, this I don't have in front of us, maybe I'll have it for next time, but says that, there's something, Gemara has a whole discussion about this. Do you have to write on a surface or with ink that is not subject to forgery or that can't be erased?
Well, would pencil work?
Pencil's a good
question.
example. Can you write on any, any surface or with any kind of ink? Or is there a requirement? So this is the story. In the Gemara, it seems like it's part of the debate between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Eliezer. If you hold Eidei Chasima Karsi, so we're talking about the raya of the shtar, and therefore it has to be written on Davar She'i Afshar Lehizdayev, something that can't be forged or erased. However, if you hold Eidei Mesira Karsi, they're present anyway. So it's not the text, it's not the objective, get, because that doesn't have any eidim on it anyway. It's the act of gerushin, which is witnessed by the two witnesses. As long as everything is fine and good when they see it, the ink is fine and the surface is not, is as long as they see that everything is written properly, that's the critical moment. That's fine. So the problem with the Rambam is really writing over a Gemara in Kedushin Daf Tes Amud Aleph. But if you look at Tosas on that Gemara and the Mefarshim on the Rambam, they're saying, I don't understand. This would only work if you're using Eidei Mesira. If you were using Eidei Chasima, the Rambam says Nuchos Gerushin. If you use Eidei Mesira, the Rambam says, then you can write on any surface you want. But if you use Eidei Chasima, you better be careful to write only on non-forgeable ink, non-forgeable surface, etc. Because the Eidim aren't there when the thing is handed over, so we have to make sure that that it's all authentic. And the only way to do that if it's not forgeable. In other words, how come the Rambam in Hilchos Ishus ignores Ksav Yad, ignores Eidei Chasima, speaks only about Eidei Mesira, and because he speaks only about Eidei Mesira, also doesn't make a distinction between ink or a surface that is subject to being forged and one that is not? Lest you say, which some of the Mefarshim do say, this isn't my question. I mean, it's also my question, but, Rabbim V'Tovim Mimeni have asked this question, right? From the earliest Rambam commentaries, they were troubled. How come the Rambam doesn't mention Eidei Chasima? He holds like the Rif, that not only Eidei Mesira Karsi, but Eidei Chasima is something we've spoken a lot about. There are two ways to create a contract, according to the Rambam, typically. One is through signing, witnesses on the document, and the other is having the witnesses be present when the document is handed over. Why, when it comes to Gerushin, does he mention both? Even though he has a preference, but they're both good. And in the Hilchos Ishus, he only has one. And it affects the surface. Number two, how come the Rambam mentions Ksav Yad in Hilchos Gerushin, that it's possible but only midrabanan? And why doesn't he even mention it in Kiddushin? Let's say you were to write a shtar Kiddushin b'Ksav Yad. So as I say, the Magid Mishnah, the Kesef Mishnah, the Lechem Mishnah, they all discuss this question. Why the discrepancy between the Rambam and Hilchos Ishus and Hilchos Gerushin? Some of them give the answer. They say, you know what, you have to read one in light of the other. The Rambam writes about the topic in a few places. It's, Divrei HaRambam, Aniyim b'makom echad, v'ashirim b'makom acher. The Rambam, writes meagerly in one place, and he fills in other places. Number one, I'd never like that answer, all things being equal. If you believe in that answer, then Rambam sometimes says Kimosha Avaer or Kimosha Biarnu. He kind of, gives you a Mar Mokum. He says, look what I wrote elsewhere. He's not saying that here. But the bigger problem is this. In the order of things, the order of Masechtas as Gittin came before Kiddushin, according to many systems, including our own. They say, V'yatzav Hoisa. That's how the Rambam explains it. But when the Rambam wrote his code, say for Nashim, he reorganized not according to the Masechtas. So in Seder Noshe, what's the first discussion in Seder Noshe? Hilchos Ishus, followed by Hilchos Gerushin. So the Rambam is going to write, if the Rambam wrote Hilchos Gerushin first, and then, he makes only like a quick reference, in Hilchos Ishus, it would be easier to buy that he's kind of just giving you the short story here, because the long story was before. But since the first time he writes about this topic is in Hilchos Ishus, and that's where he gives you only a one-dimensional presentation, and it's only later in Hilchos Gerushin that he gives you 3 options, that's very peculiar. So I'm going to have to explain this next time, but let me leave you with this. The Meiri already, in the beginning of Masechet Kiddushin, doesn't speak about the Ksav Yad part. It's not that I recall. But he says, you know what? The Rambam's view is that Edom signed on the document without their presence at the time of the transmission of the document, works in Gittin, but not in Kiddushin. He doesn't explain why. But this was also the view of the Maharshal in the 16th century, in Yam Shel Shlomo, and later on in the 18th century, the Vilna Gaon also understood the Rambam this way, that the Rambam distinguishes between Kiddushin and Gerushin. In Kiddushin, you can only work with Eidim Masira, the physical presence of the Eidim. In Gerushin, even Eidei Chasima b'diavad are good enough. And some of the Mefarshim say the same thing with regard to Ksav Yad, that the Rambam omits Ksav Yad in Hilchos Ishus, not because he discusses it, and you just have to fill out the picture in Hilchos Gerushin, but because Ksav Yad does not work for Kiddushin. It only works for Gerushin. If you look, with this will conclude, Tosfos already discusses the problem. Tosfos in Yevamos, right, earlier, if you look like page 5 or so, if you could go back just for one more minute, where we have Yevamos. Just keep going back a little more. Back. Towards the earlier pages of the Marmakomos. Keep going back. More, back. Sorry, even more. Quite a bit. I'll tell you when to stop. Keep going back. Where we have Yevamos, where it says Tosfos Yevamos Lamed Aleph Amud Beis. No, that's all the way back. Keep going now forward. Forward. I think we went too forward already. There's something in between there. If not, I'll just leave it for next time. Back a little more. More. Oh, no, if keep going back. Sorry, that's something else. Yeah. Okay, maybe I'll get it for next time. It's in here. Okay, let me just say it this way. Tosfos, okay, I think, no, okay. The Tosfos in Yevamos, Daf Lamed Aleph Amud Beis, already raises the question whether or not Kiddushin works with a Ksav Yad. And the Rajba and the Ritva in Yevamos, Lamed Aleph Amud Beis, and the Ritva in Kiddushin, Daf Samach Amud Beis, we'll read it for next time, debate this question. But what's striking is the Rambam's different treatment in Hilchos Ishus and Hilchos Gerushin. That's a bit of a puzzle. I'm going to suggest that that's an important puzzle that is a breakthrough in the way that we understand the concept of Eidei Kiyum and the concept of Ksav Yad and Eidei Chasima. So we will, in Mirz Hashem, finish with this. I thought we'd do it today, but we'll finish with it hopefully next week. And then we will move on to some other issues, connected, but other issues. Okay, so everybody have a wonderful week.
Thank you so much, Rabbi.
Thank
Have a
you.
good night. Thank you.
Thank you.
Koach,
And thanks
koach.
for the help on the Marmakomos.
Okay.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Have a good week, everyone.